field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing the song and the carrying sign, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people sweeping their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody looks, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to this afternoon's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm pleased to have on as my guest someone I've had on before, Branko Marcetic, who is a staff writer for Jacobin, and he is also the author of the book that I'm going to be interviewing him about, Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. And it's kind of a little late to make the case now that Bernie Sanders has dropped out, but we're going to talk about his record and why Branko calls him yesterday's man. And we're going to get into a lot more detail than people may think they already know. So stick with this show, folks. You're going to learn a lot about this guy who could very well be, but may not very well be, that's something we're going to discuss at the end, our next president. I'm going to read something from your introduction, which kind of lays out the theme of the book. Even if Biden manages to beat Trump, there is every chance that his presidency will produce the rise of someone much worse. Rather than appealing to the material, class-based interests that unite voters across racial, gender, religious, or other lines, Biden has instead sought to find a non-existent middle ground between working-class Americans and the rich and powerful, often leaning toward the latter. Rather than offering a bold alternative, Biden has spent his career reflexively adopting his right-wing opponents' positions as his own, genuinely believing in consensus and bipartisanship for their own sake. He has repeatedly worked with Republicans to advance the lion's share of their political goals, dismantling the legacy of the New Deal in the process. At the same time, whether it has been crime, drugs, terrorism, or something else, Biden has tended to get swept up in every right-wing panic of the last few decades, often going even further than Republicans in his response. All of this has supposedly been on behalf of the, quote, middle class, a group Biden defines as white, suburban, and largely conservative voters, whose interests alone he sees as essential to political success. And I think that's a really great summation of what this book is about and everything that he has done politically. But I want to ask you this. You say that he did all these things to get elected. Yet in reading your book, you talk about every single Republican opponent he ever had as being weak and underfunded. So my question is this. There seems to be an absence in this book of going beyond the public record and actually talking to people who knew Biden, who know Biden, to try to get a sense of his psychology and his motivation. I mean, you go a little bit into his parents' history, his grandparents' history, and his tragedies in his own life. But aside from that, you really don't delve into it in a big way. Now, understand, this is only a 200-page book. I don't know how long it took you to write it. It's not like Robert Caro, who spent 20 years doing 4 in-depth biographies of JFK. But would you, if you had your druthers, wanted to talk to more people about him? And what else can you offer as to why he took these middle ground Republican policies in the regard to the point that I made that his opponents were never really serious opponents?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in an ideal world, I would have loved to spend a long time tracking down people who had worked with him or under him and talk to them and get their thoughts about him. At least if they would have talked to me, I'm not sure if they would have. The fact was I had basically about 6 months to write the book, and the public record on Biden, because he's had at this point, nearly 50-year-long career. It was so vast. And I really had to do a lot of the research from scratch. Even though I had researched him earlier, I had to do a whole new spate of research on him. And that already, I barely finished the book on time. In the end, the book ended up coming out by some sort of cosmic, comedic coincidence that came out the day before South Carolina. So literally the last day when everyone believed he really was yesterday's man, that he really was done for. And of course, then he came bouncing back, which I, jokingly say that's probably my fault. People read the book and they were like, "Oh yeah, this guy." Conservative voters thought, "Yeah, this guy sounds great." I think there's probably a lot of things that obviously come into his motivation, but I do think there's more than enough in the public record to suggest that so much of what he did was because of a fear of losing. I mean, as you know, a lot of his opponents were not particularly formidable, but the important thing to note is that Biden came into power in the Senate having defeated a really well-established, well-loved, pretty long-serving Republican senator. Actually, he had been governor, he'd been a congressman, and then he became a senator. And it came out of nowhere. It was really a surprise when no one expected it. And I think that haunted Biden in many ways. He was well aware that that could happen again. And so even when his opponents were not particularly strong, Biden would treat them very seriously. And particularly, a good case study of this is 2002, where Biden went up against a guy called Ray Clatworthy, who actually had run against him in 1996. And he was this pretty right-wing businessman who had a lot of money, unlike Biden's previous opponents. And he didn't really give Biden a run for his money, but he gave him a bit of a formidable challenge in 1996. And so in 2002, 6 years later, as the Bush administration is kind of gearing up for war, Clatworthy runs again. And at the time, political observers said, I believe it was someone from the Cook Political Report actually said, this race is snoozeville. Who cares? Biden wins by the exact same amount every year, and this guy doesn't look like he's going to give him a challenge. That ended up being true. He didn't really give Biden a challenge. Biden won by the same margin they seem to win every year. But Biden took it very seriously, and actually he started his campaign a few months earlier because Clatworthy had already started spending on ads and that kind of thing earlier than people expected, and so Biden matched him, which shows kind of how seriously he took that challenge. And in the course of that election, that's a big part of the reason why Biden ended up being such a gung-ho pro-Iraq war Democrat, is because Ray Clatworthy made it known, I'm going to attack Biden for being insufficiently supportive of George Bush. And at the time, there was this huge jingoistic upsurge. There was this kind of rally around the leader element, and so Biden really moved right to try and take that oxygen away from him. So there is evidence for that. That even though they may seem weak, Biden was scared and kind of intimidated by these guys.
Okay, now you make a point that he had expressed presidential ambitions very early on in his life. And you also quote a former state Democratic Party chairperson as saying, he had lots of energy and idealism and was always assertive, but to my knowledge, he had no substantive ideology. Now, I've had you on my show before to do a deep dive into Kamala Harris. And he reminds me of her in that respect. A lot of early presidential ambitions, very careerist with no ideology. How do you think he compares to her? Because you've studied her as well.
I mean, that describes about 80 to 90% of most politicians pretty much anywhere in the world, particularly in Western countries, wealthy Western countries like the US. Most people in these contexts get into politics not because they necessarily have a particular idea or commitment that they want to live out or see to fruition, but because basically they want to be important, they want power, they want influence, and they end up chasing a dream that in some cases they've had since early adulthood. I mean, Obama is a great example of this. Obama initially wanted to be a novelist, and he decided, I'm going to run for president. And he, much like Biden, much like Kamala Harris, much like Pete Buttigieg, you could keep the list going forever and ever. Obama organized his entire adult life around the idea of eventually getting to the presidency. It worked for him. There are many people who do that fall short. Worked for Obama, and Biden's the same. And I think that's, besides the fact they didn't really have a very strong ideological commitment, I think that explains a lot of his choices, because if your only guiding star is to stay in power and eventually climb the ladder and not necessarily achieve anything in particular, then you'll do all sorts of things. Sometimes they can be good things, depending on if that's the path of least resistance. And then if the path of least resistance is doing bad things, you'll do those too. And so Biden has been behind, some of the worst disasters that have really afflicted working class Americans for the last 40 years in chasing that goal.
Okay, so when he was early on, much more progressive, it sounds like you're saying you might attribute that to the times that he was in. Let me read some quotes here, because I think the Bernie Sanders people who are watching my show, who are more comfortable with a politician who has had an ideology, and obviously Bernie is the exception that proves the rule, might be shocked to hear these things coming out of Joe Biden's mouth. Everybody's opposed to public housing. Nobody wants it in their backyard, but damn it, if you have a moral obligation, provide it, he told the press, while cautioning that he was not Crusader Rabbit championing the rights of the people. The stance nevertheless earned him some enmity during the campaign, including the labor of N-word lover. And then you talk about he was in the Newcastle County Council, revealed a sharp, ambitious liberal politician genuinely concerned about poverty and environmental degradation and willing to stand up to corporate interests. He fought to block construction of oil refineries and protect vital wetlands, called for a halt to the dredging of the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, denounced the destruction of tidal marshes, and tried to de-escalate the construction of a controversial superhighway that he called a 10-lane monstrosity. He also criticized a report on public housing for not paying enough attention to the very poor, and spoke out against the bulldozing of dilapidated homes of the county's poor Black residents. Seeing a balance between the county's growth and the preservation of its natural resources, he worked to restrict development, or at least slow it. He called for more funding of mass transit and denounced the senseless highways built in its place. And I mean, what do you account for that? Do you think that he actually maybe did have an ideology, or did he think that was politically popular in his county?
I don't know about an ideology. I think certainly he had concerns that he cared about. I think, he was genuinely concerned about the environment, particularly in Delaware, and as that kind of points to. And for the rest of his career, he actually had pretty good scores from basically every environmental group. He sort of points out to the fact that he introduced this very early climate change legislation. I mean, the problem there is that Biden's actual ideology that he ended up serving, which they tend to be this kind of Republican fiscal hawkishness, the idea that you have to cut spending and make government as small as possible, that ended up working against that stuff. I mean, through the 90s, when he was pushing Clinton to cut spending, even as he was getting good scores for environmental organizations back home in Delaware, the budget cuts that Clinton had introduced, largely at the urging of Biden and others, actually undermined the state's ability to protect the environment. So, this is the thing. I think he probably did care about the environment. I think he probably still does in some abstract sense, but there's this is not unique to him, but there's a failure to connect how that is connected to every other policy, and this shift from the 80s onwards to shrink government and to basically give private businesses more and more freedom to do whatever they want.
When he ran for Senate, I want to talk about that because that's still in the early days, and he was very young, and he didn't even expect to win. He was 29 years old when he became a senator. He ran, and this is probably going to be the last time you're hearing any words that you agree with come out of Joe Biden's mouth, because I want to read to you some more things. He ran for Senate against war, the Vietnam War, for public housing, for prisoner rehabilitation, for youth jobs programs, for Social Security increases. He criticized millionaires, and I'm just going to read this to you. Biden wasn't afraid to name enemies. His criticism of, quote, the millionaires who don't pay any taxes at all, end quote, and the, quote, billion-dollar corporations who want a ride on the public's back, end quote, became a staple of his campaign. He ran full-page newspaper ads demanding the elimination of tax preferences for, quote, special interests, property tax exemptions for elderly people on fixed incomes, and freezes on prices, utility rates, and interest rates. Quote, if you're a working man, you cannot hope to escape taxes. If you're a rich man, you may, the ads charged. Biden hit Boggs, his opponent, for defending Standard Oil's absurdly small tax bill. And in the middle of a debate, he criticized both parties for being, quote, controlled by big money and unresponsive, quote, to the tax woes of the Americans' middle class. I just found that completely astounding, because if I didn't tell you who was saying those words, you would have thought it was Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I mean, that was probably, for me, the most fascinating thing I found in researching the book. And I think it speaks to not just his shift, his personal shift, but it speaks to what kind of effect that larger political shifts can actually have on individual people. I mean, I think, if it had been 10 years later, Biden would not have run that campaign. But because it was in the early 70s, the twilight of the New Deal order, he ended up, even though he was this guy who was he had conservative instincts, and, he didn't have a particularly strong ideology outside of that. Because that was the way that the kind of tide was going at the time, he just went with it. And, exactly by the 80s, as things moved to a more conservative direction, he then goes in that direction as well. Although now he's definitely, even as things are shifting the opposite way, he's kind of very stubbornly, I think, resisting that at the moment.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the 70s before we get into the 80s, because almost immediately he pivoted on the busing thing. And much has been made of his, support for Strom Thurmond and working with him and James Eastland. There was this 1975 Eagleton-Biden amendment. It didn't pass, but it ended the idea of Northern liberals being the bulwark against using busing to address segregation. And then there was the Roth-Biden bill, which I want you to talk about. He voted against Black judges, but none of it hurt his relationship with the Black community. We're going to talk more about the crime bill in the 80s. But first talk about what he did in the 70s with regard to busing that we don't already know about.
Yeah, so actually the Eagleton-Biden amendment did pass, and that was kind of the big legacy of his kind of anti-busing push. But you're right, there was an earlier amendment that he had put forward that didn't end up passing, and even though it didn't end up becoming law, as you say, what it did, and this was remarked upon at the time, it cracked this commitment among the Senate, and particularly the liberal members of the Senate, to kind of vote for desegregation, on a reflexive basis. That was the first thing that kind of showed that, hey, actually, there are cracks in here that point to a lack of commitment or a waning commitment to that. The Eagleton-Biden amendment, which passed, barred the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at the time from using money to fund busing. And it actually, ironically, did not have any impact on Biden's the situation in Delaware, which is ostensibly why Biden was taking this position, because there was a court order in Delaware that said you have to desegregate the schools, and that means busing, and a lot of people got angry, and Biden kind of shifted to meet that anger. But that particular bill didn't actually do anything with court order busing. Like I said, it's only to do with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And they ended up being this big bugbear for civil rights workers and school administrators around the country, because they found that even when they were doing voluntary segregation plans. Because of this ban on funds, they weren't even able to carry these voluntary plans out to fruition, and people complained about it. And as you say, I mean, the reason Biden voted against those historic appointments, those two black appointments, and he was, by the way, the only person on the Judiciary Committee to do that, and the Judiciary Committee at the time was filled with old line segregationists. And yet, he was this liberal from a border state who's the only one to vote against these two black nominees, and that was because of their position on busing. And again, this was part of that political shift that was happening. There was a lot of anger over busing, and by 1975, when that court order comes into Delaware, Biden previously had basically voted down the line pro-busing, and then after that, he voted pro-busing once, and he voted against busing 19 times. So that shows you how much was shifted. People said at the time, I think it was the Wilmington News Journal or some local paper that said, well, Biden, like every convert, has become the most zealous prosecutor of his new faith, because he wasn't an anti-busser before, but now to really overcompensate, he became kind of the most ardent anti-busser out of almost anyone.
Okay. So then you said when he ran in 78, he literally snatched the platform from his Republican opponent, this guy named Baxter. And you quoted a guy, quote, "In spite of his horrendous record, like all Delaware politicians of opposing busing, he will vote the way I would want him to most of the time," one liberal voter said. So I think that kind of tells you the difference right there between a liberal and a progressive. Because I don't think a progressive would vote for somebody who had that kind of record. He started off supporting national health insurance. And then at that point, he said he would fight it against it. And then what he learned in 1978, I'm going to read from that paragraph. "There comes a point in any politician's career when they must balance their ambitions against political realities and decide what they are comfortable sacrificing for the sake of expediency. The 1978 election was a learning experience for Biden in this respect. It taught him he could court wealthy donors and businesses and still get union backing. It taught him he could move way to the right and still count on the support of Democratic voters, at least as long as a scary conservative was the only other option. And it taught him he could, in fact, he needed to, strategically sacrifice the cause of civil rights to win over the fabled political center." Now, I think that he was very smart because he has been able to win up until this point. So the question remains, he won South Carolina. Now, we haven't gotten to talk about we're going to get into the crime bill of the 80s, which most people don't talk about. They talk about the crime bill of 1994. But he still managed to get the support of the African-American community after all this. What do you attribute that to?
I think a couple things. For one, Biden's a very good retail politician. People may not remember now that he's kind of going on interviews, reading off paper, and just speaking completely incoherently, and forgetting lines and making really bizarre points. But once upon a time, and it wasn't that long ago, he was actually a very charismatic, eloquent politician, very charming. That's part of his whole thing. The Amtrak Joe, the middle class Joe thing. I mean, I think he thrives on this personal connection that he can strike with voters. That's part of what's so difficult for him right now is when he's stuck in a basement and he can't actually speak or touch to people. I think that's part of it. I think he was able to win black voters over in that way. I think the other part of it is that as the quote from that particular liberal voter that you quoted said, I mean, this is the old predicament for liberals and progressives and anyone left of that, is that in the US political system, you often end up with this kind of Sophie's choice, where there's a big bad scary Republican or a big bad scary right winger, and then usually a Democrat that is not as bad but isn't great on a whole host of issues, and you have to make this this lesser evil choice. I mean, that's the Democratic playbook for decades now. It's the playbook they're using in this election, where they're basically telling anyone sort of left of center who's not excited about voting for Biden, saying, well, you know what, if you don't do that, then Donald Trump gets 4 more years. So we're not going to cater to you, but we're going to guilt you into voting for him and assume
Right. Well, you know, they tried that with Hillary Clinton, and I don't think that really worked.